A gaze that didn't ask for permission, but saw everything I tried to hide. I don't remember what day it was or what I was wearing, but I remember the moment, how still everything became when our eyes met. The way time slowed as if it didn't want to interrupt. And it wasn't the kind of look that makes you flustered or self-conscious. It was the kind that made me feel known, seen in the quietest, most sacred way. Not admired, not judged, just recognized. He was across the room, laughing about something with friends his age, careless and alive in a way that youth allows. I was near the window, lost in my own thoughts, holding a glass I barely sipped from. My body was there, but my mind was somewhere else, caught between years I could never get back and dreams I'd long folded away. And then I looked up, and he was looking at me. He didn't look away, not out of arrogance. Not out of boldness, but because he didn't see me as someone to avoid or someone to impress. He saw me like I was already familiar, like he was remembering something, not discovering it. I should have looked away. That's what I've been trained to do. Don't hold eye contact. Don't invite anything. Don't awaken anything you've already convinced yourself is gone. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something in me softened in that moment. Something I didn't know was still alive. We didn't speak that night. He didn't walk over. There were no cheesy lines or awkward introductions, but something stayed. A thread, invisible and fragile, connected us from that night forward. And somehow we both knew it. The next time I saw him, it wasn't coincidence, but it didn't feel like pursuit either. It felt like gravity. We simply ended up near each other again and again, until silence gave way to words and words gave way to something deeper. He asked me about things no one ever did. Not what I did for a living, not where I grew up, but why I always stared into the distance when I thought no one was watching. Why my smile disappeared the second I turned away. Why I always hesitated before saying how I truly felt. He wasn't trying to peel back my layers. He was simply aware that I had them, and that alone felt revolutionary. For so long, I had been trying to hide the parts of me that didn't fit. The lines on my face, the heaviness in my voice when I spoke of past things, the ache in my body that had learned how to move gracefully through discomfort. I had become good at dimming myself just enough to not disturb the expectations around me. But with him, none of it worked, because he didn't look at me with expectation. He looked at me like he'd been waiting, and the strangest part, it didn't feel unnatural. It didn't feel like something forbidden or forced. It felt like something old, something that had been here long before us, just waiting to be remembered. He'd say things sometimes that disarmed me completely. You don't need to make yourself smaller for me. You don't have to be strong right now. You're not too much. And those words, those simple, unpolished truth, cut deeper than any grand romantic gesture ever could, because they came from a place I'd almost forgotten existed, pure presence. He wasn't looking at my age, or my story, or my guarded heart. He was just there, offering space where I didn't have to perform. We'd sit in silence for hours sometimes, no pressure to fill it, no hunger to impress, just the comfort of two people who had nothing to prove and everything to feel. He told me once that when he saw me that first night, something in him stilled, like the noise in his head finally paused. I knew exactly what he meant, because that's what his gaze had done to me. It stilled the noise. There was a night I'll never forget. Rain had started to fall unexpectedly. We were walking, and he pulled me under a small overhang just before the downpour came. We were close, so close I could hear the way his breath changed when he looked at me. And in that soft pause, with water tracing its path down the streets, and the sky lit in a shade of quiet silver, he touched my face gently, not with hunger, not with urgency, but with reverence. "I see you," he whispered. And I broke, not because I didn't believe him, but because part of me had been waiting so long to be seen that I didn't know how to accept it without falling apart. His touch wasn't asking for anything. It was just there, holding the parts of me that I had long buried under years of shoulds and musts and never agains. There was a kind of intimacy in that gaze, one that didn't begin or end in the body, one that didn't rush or demand. It was the kind of love that didn't need a name or a label. It just existed because it had to, because it always had. Some people meet through shared hobbies, some through dating apps, some through mutual friends, but sometimes two souls recognize each other before words are ever exchanged, and when that happens, nothing ever really feels the same again. I've known passion, I've known heartbreak. I've known affection dressed up as love, but what I felt in that gaze, that quiet, unrelenting gaze, was different. It wasn't desire, it was return, and no one ever tells you this. But when someone sees you like that, without fear, without hesitation, you start to remember who you were before the world taught you how to forget. He never asked me to change, never once made me feel like I was temporary or fragile or in need of being justified. He just stayed present, aware, unshaken, and in that staying I bloomed not for him, but because someone finally made it safe to do so. And I think that's the rarest kind of love, the one that doesn't rush in or burn bright just to vanish, but the kind that sits beside you in your stillness and simply sees, because when someone sees you like that, you stop hiding, and for the first time in years, I didn't want to hide anymore. Loneliness wasn't loud until silence became beautiful beside him. I used to think loneliness was a sound, something that echoed in empty rooms or crept in through the quiet moments between conversations, but it wasn't, not really. It was a feeling that lived in places no one could see. In a crowded room, in a marriage that looked fine from the outside, in a life filled with responsibility but devoid of being truly understood. I had learned to carry that loneliness like a second skin. It didn't cry out, it didn't make noise, it just stayed. I had forgotten what it was like to be near someone and feel peace instead of pressure, comfort instead of performance. I had gotten so used to being the strong one, the composed one, the one who always had something to say or something to fix, until him. He didn't come into my life with fire. He didn't try to impress. He didn't come offering promises or looking to save me. He just showed up, sat near, quiet, unassuming, and yet something about his presence stirred something in me that I thought had long gone to sleep. The first time he sat with me, I remember thinking, this can't mean anything. He's just being kind. But there was a gentleness in how he didn't fill the silence. He didn't try to break it. He let it be. And in that stillness, I felt a kind of safety I hadn't known in years. We weren't talking. We weren't touching. We weren't doing anything that looked like love. But something was happening, slowly, deeply, as if his nearness was speaking a language I had forgotten how to hear. He'd glance over occasionally, not to read me, not to study me, but just to let me know he was still there. He didn't fidget. He didn't pull out his phone. He just stayed. One evening, we were sitting on the porch. The sky was that shade of blue that only happens just before night. Everything was quiet except the distant hum of crickets and the rustling of trees. I was holding a cup of tea I'd long forgotten to sip, and he was beside me, his elbows resting on his knees, head tilted toward the ground, like he was listening to the world breathe. And then he said, "You don't always have to talk, you know. I like being quiet with you." I don't think he realized what those words did to me, how they reached into the deepest parts of me and uncurled something tightly wound. For so long, I had filled silences with words, with explanations, with apologies, but with him I didn't have to. There were no expectations in his silence, no questions waiting to be answered, no evaluations of whether I was too much or not enough, just space, sacred, wordless space. Sometimes he'd bring me small things, a book he thought I might like, A stone from the river he thought was beautiful, not gifts, not tokens, just quiet acknowledgments that he saw what mattered to me, that he noticed things even I had forgotten to care about. One night I cried beside him. I didn't plan to. I didn't even know it was coming, but something inside me cracked open, and the tears came before I could stop them. And he didn't flinch. He didn't try to fix it or tell me everything would be okay. He just gently placed his hand near mine, not on it, not over it, just near, close enough that I could feel him, but far enough that I didn't feel crowded. That one gesture, that small offering of presence, said more than any words ever could. He gave me pieces of myself I didn't know were missing. The quiet way he listened reminded me that my thoughts had value, even if they weren't spoken out loud. The way he looked at me reminded me that I was still beautiful, even if no one had said it in years, and the way he stayed reminded me that I was still worth staying for. We never made plans. There was no map for what we were becoming. But somehow it didn't matter. There was something in the rhythm of being near him that made life feel softer, slower, more alive. I started to smile again, not because I was trying to seem okay, but because I actually felt light returning to places that had long been dark. I began to notice the wind again, the sound of rain on the roof, the taste of things I used to rush through. It was like I was waking up in my own skin again, piece by piece, and I think the most unexpected part of it all was that he never once asked me to be different. He didn't look at me and see someone broken. He didn't see someone older. He didn't see someone with baggage. He just saw me. There's something deeply intimate about sitting beside someone who makes your silence feel full instead of empty, who doesn't need to be entertained or distracted, who can simply be present, and in that presence makes you feel worthy again. I didn't know that kind of love could exist outside of words, outside of passion, outside of promises, but it does, and when you feel it, you never forget it. Because sometimes the deepest kind of love is the kind that doesn't ask for anything loud. It just sits quietly beside you and brings you home to yourself. And in the silence beside him, I was never alone again. Desire was never rushed. It waited like it had loved me in another life. I didn't expect to feel anything when he looked at me, not in that way. Not anymore. I had grown used to being seen through the lens of utility, of maturity, of stability. I was the one people came to for advice, for comfort, for calm, but never for desire, never for the quiet ache of wanting someone simply because their presence made your chest rise differently. I wasn't used to being felt, but there he was, and there I was, and something in the air between us was changing in ways I didn't have words for. He never touched me the way men used to, quickly, hungrily, as if trying to take something. His touch was rare, light, and always offered like a question, not a demand. It was in the way his fingers brushed against mine when handing me something, the way his hand hovered near my lower back when we walked through a doorway. Always close, always warm, never forced that heat. God, it wasn't like fire. It was like an ember, slow, soft, glowing beneath everything else, and maybe that's what made it different. I had known fire before. Fast, hungry, impatient, and it always ended in smoke. But this was warmth, this was steady. It didn't want to consume, it wanted to stay. There were days he would just look at me, not with hunger, but with something far more dangerous. With knowing, like he had already met me once, in some other life where things had been easier, simpler, like he had waited through time to see me again, and when his eyes met mine, there was no rush to it, just quiet recognition, and a patience that melted something I thought had frozen over. I remember once we sat across from each other, knees barely touching. The air was heavy with things unspoken. He looked at me for a long time, like he wasn't just seeing me now, but seeing every version of me that ever existed, the girl I used to be, the woman I had become, and the one I was still trying to find again. He didn't say anything, just reached forward and gently tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't bold, but my whole body felt it, because the way he did it said everything he didn't speak. That I was seen, that I was still wanted, that I was still touchable and desire. It didn't crash into me, it crept in. It arrived like a whisper, not a scream, the kind of desire that makes your skin remember things before your mind does. The kind that makes a room feel too quiet and too loud at the same time. It wasn't about bodies, not really. It was about presence, energy. The way he existed near me felt like sunlight coming through a window I hadn't opened in years. I didn't even know how much I'd missed warmth until it found me again. We'd sit close, sometimes our legs touching, and I'd feel this slow, aching calm wash over me, like I didn't have to do anything to be worthy of this moment. Like being near each other was enough, and yet there was always this underlying current, a pulse beneath the stillness, that reminded me we were both alive, that my skin still wanted to be read like a story, that I still had chapters left that hadn't been touched. He never rushed, never reached for more than what I gave. He waited, and in his waiting I felt safe enough to want. There was a night I'll never forget. We were alone, the room dimly lit, music humming low in the background. I was sitting on the edge of the couch. He was on the floor beside me, head resting against my knee. He reached up and placed his hand gently on my thigh, not high, not suggestive, just there. And when he looked up at me, I saw something raw in his eyes, like he was asking a question with no words, not can I, but do you feel it too? I did. I leaned down slowly and kissed his forehead, soft, slow, like I was writing a memory onto his skin. And when his lips finally found mine, it wasn't a conquest. It was a return, familiar, tender, a kiss that said I'm here instead of I want. The way we touched after that wasn't about need. It was about reverence, like we were learning the map of each other, not to own, but to understand. Every brush of his fingers, every sigh from my lips felt like homecoming. Nothing rushed, nothing demanded. Just time stretching out long enough for us to explore every silent, sacred part of the connection. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. There were moments I'd cry in his arms without even knowing why. And he'd just hold me, letting the silence hold us both, as if he understood that sometimes desire isn't about hunger, but healing. That touch can be a balm, not a fire, and in that space, I softened. I opened. I began to believe again, not just in love, but in myself, that I was still someone who could be touched slowly, kissed gently, held completely, because what grew between us wasn't something loud. It didn't arrive with fireworks. It didn't shout its name. It breathed. It pulsed. It warmed. And most of all, it waited. Waited until I was ready to be seen again. Waited until I was ready to let someone close again. Waited until I could look in his eyes and see not what I had lost, but everything I was still capable of giving. It was love, disguised as desire, and desire, disguised as home. It wasn't a body he reached for first. It was my spirit, weary and unseen. I think most people forget how invisible you start to feel after a while, not because you disappear, but because the world stops looking closely. You show up, you smile, you do what's asked of you, and yet the part of you that longs to be touched beyond the surface, to be noticed, begins to fade quietly in the background, unheard. I had lived in that silence for so long, I thought it had become part of me. And then he came in, not with declarations or dazzling moves. He entered gently, like someone stepping into a room already grieving. He didn't try to fix me. He didn't try to save me. He simply noticed. And that noticing felt louder than anything I'd heard in years. He asked me about my thoughts, not what I'd done that day, not what I needed to get done tomorrow, but what was on my mind. The first time he did that, I didn't even know how to answer. It had been so long since someone asked without expectation. So long since someone looked at me like they actually wanted to hear the answer. We talked for hours sometimes, not about anything particularly grand. But the way he listened made every word I spoke feel sacred. I would say something half-formed, unsure, and instead of correcting me or waiting for his turn to talk, he'd nod, tilt his head slightly, and let the silence expand just enough to hold my uncertainty. That's when I started to notice something inside me shift. My thoughts became less guarded, my voice less careful, and with every conversation, I felt a little less invisible. There was a night, rain tapping softly against the windows, a low lamp casting a warm glow in the corner, and I told him about a part of me I hadn't shared with anyone, a fear I carried so deep it had knotted itself into my daily life. I expected him to pull away, to offer advice, to quietly change the subject, but he didn't flinch. He just looked at me, not with pity, not with shock, but with the kind of softness that says, "I see you and you're safe here." That moment unraveled me. He didn't offer me a solution, he offered me his presence, and in that presence something miraculous happened. I began to feel real again, not for what I looked like, not for how useful I was, but for the parts of me that existed even in silence. The way my mind wandered, the way my laughter curved into a whisper, the way I reached for words when emotions got tangled, he stayed through it all, and in that staying, my spirit began to rise. There was no pressure between us. No rules, no need to define anything. It was all unspoken, but deeply felt. When he looked at me, I never once felt like an object, never like a trophy, never like a passing phase. There was something steady in his gaze, something that said, "You don't have to be anything but exactly who you are." That kind of seeing, it's rare and terrifying, because it means you can't hide anymore, and I didn't want to. I started to notice the way I stood when I was around him, straighter, softer, not because I was trying to impress, but because I finally felt seen. It was like I'd spent years curling into myself, protecting the parts that had been ignored for too long, and here he was, offering nothing more than the truth of his attention, and somehow that was enough to make those parts come alive again. I never had to ask for his presence. He gave it freely, without conditions, without expectation, and there's something about that kind of giving. It teaches you how to receive again. He made me feel like I was worth staying for, not because I had something to offer, not because I could entertain or please or perform, but because I existed, because I breathed and felt and thought, because somewhere in me was a soul he recognized. And that recognition gave me permission to come back to myself. We spent more time in silence than most people would be comfortable with, but our silence was never empty. It was full of breath, of quiet glances, of the kind of peace that only arrives when two people stop pretending. There were moments he'd just rest his hand near mine, not touching, just close enough to feel, and that was enough. It was his way of saying, "I'm here," and somehow that meant more than any grand gesture ever could. He taught me that love doesn't always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it walks in gently, barefoot, with eyes that don't turn away, and desire, real desire, doesn't come from urgency or need. It comes from presence, from knowing someone not as a body, but as a whole. That's what he did. He reached for the parts of me that weren't wrapped in skin, the parts that had gone too long without being held, and in doing that, he reminded me who I was beneath all the layers I had learned to wear. He never made promises, but somehow, his presence became the most beautiful promise of all. Thank you for being here with me. Through every glance that saw past the surface, every silence that healed what noise never could, every slow, burning touch that asked for nothing, and every moment I felt seen not as a body, but as a soul trying to breathe again. If any part of this story echoed something inside you, if you've ever been loved quietly, deeply, without demands, loved back to life, then you already know this wasn't just a story, it was a remembering. So if these moments touched you, stay close, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications, because sometimes all it takes is one story to feel less alone, and maybe the next one will be yours.